The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
We got tanks up there. Let's follow a range on Detroit. I'm coming around that on the target right now. I've got a couple of these right in front of me. I'm going out for it. Right, I got him.
And the Lead Pursuit podcast is back. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit differently about some history. We're going to talk about Midway because we know that Andy is releasing his new Midway starter set here soon for Blood Red Skies. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk specifically about historical fiction that's been written by Kevin Miller, who's a naval aviator, A-7 pilot, F-18 pilot, squadron commander, has logged over 1,000 carrier-arrested landings, and he's going to be here tonight to talk both about his modern military writings and his writings about the Battle of Midway. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Doug. Thanks for having me.
The good news is we also have Brett on because we drug him back in, even though he doesn't know how to spell naval aviation as an Army Ranger.
Hey, everybody. Happy to be here.
Always glad to pick on you, Brett. Thanks for joining us. And this really was put together by my buddy Rob over at Fights On. So, Rob, thanks for helping put this together, and thanks for joining us tonight.
You bet. Thanks. So, Kevin, after 3 great Raven books, then you write Silver Waterfall. So the question is, what led you to choose Midway as historical fiction?
Midway is, I think, everyone in naval aviation, maybe aviation, is just fascinated by the story. I mean, this is a battle that we were not supposed to win, that the Japanese put to sea 200 ships of the combined fleet, and we mustered 27 ships. And all of our battleships were not able to fight, many of them resting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor still. And battleships were still a main capital ship in the way that navies thought they would fight each other. And at Midway, the Japanese put too much credence in that philosophy, but it is a battle that I've lectured on for years, and I was fascinated by the command and control aspects of it. We think of Nimitz and Spruance and McCluskey and Waldron. These guys are mythical figures, and they did great deeds, and they did, but they were flawed men, as we all are, and so I wanted to write the story of Midway with in the historical fiction construct, showing the emotion, showing the uncertainty of these real men who lived. I didn't change any facts, and all the characters are real men who fought it. And it is a story that I felt needed to be told, just as Michael Sharer wrote The Killer Angels about the Battle of Gettysburg. Without, you can study the set piece movements of the armies, okay, got it. But when you read historical fiction like Sharer, you're there. And now you can get inside the Longstreet and Lee and their arguments about what they should do next. And I find it all fascinating. So it was a labor of love to write.
I definitely felt that way. You brought me into the cockpit and the bridge of the Akagi with Nagumo and his staff, and Spruance's flag bridge. That was just awesome. Did you have this story in you for a long time, or is this truly a project you started kind of after Raven series?
After I finished Fight, Flip went on shore duty, so Flip's getting a break. He's probably in the Pentagon hating his life, to tell you the truth.
But wouldn't make a good novel.
No.
Commuting on 395.
Although I assure there's plenty of drama in there.
Yeah, I was about to say there's plenty of drama and there's all kinds of politics, so it'd make a great reality TV show. Oh wait, did I say that? Yeah.
But I'm glad that I wrote the Silver Waterfall when I did. After I wrote the first 3, and you learn things, of course, every time you do a project, and you get in theory you get better, and It's a novel, though, that I did a lot of research for, and so I'm fortunate that I live in Pensacola, and just down the street is the National Naval Aviation Museum, and in that museum is the Emil Bueller Reference Library, and there's plenty of books that you've read that are very commonly known on Midway. They're all there, but what is also there in the archives are the Bombing 6 After Action Report, written by Lieutenant Best, and his flight logs, the official Marine Corps narrative of the battle, and which they claim that they got some hits on the morning of June 4th. Now history has proven that's not the case. This is not to say that, and even the Bombing 6 report is inaccurate. There's a lot of inaccuracies that those that fought the battle a day or two removed, that's what they thought. They thought they had hit that ship, and they thought this had happened, and it hadn't. And in decades later, we know it hadn't through all the sources and ship's log books and what have you. But it's an interesting study of human nature. This is what we thought happened. I mean, there's stories of I saw the squadron turn right, and another young man in the same formation swears the squadron turned left. And it was really fascinating for me to learn so much more about the battle that I didn't know.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting parts, as we've talked on the podcast before about history, that there's the official story you tell, there's the story that you think happened, and then there's beyond that what really happened, and that so many times there's conflicting perceptions, conflicting remembrances of it. And I'll be quite honest, I don't think I ever filed an accurate combat sit rep because we didn't remember everything we did until maybe even hours and days later. But the fascinating compilation of all that makes a narrative that to me is larger than just the reading of the history. Because I'll be honest, being obviously from naval aviation as a Marine F-18 Wizzo, I think I'd probably studied Midway till I was blue in the face. But there's always for me, it's much more relatable to read it as historical fiction. And I can suddenly step back and I can think, okay, what were the command decisions? What were the individual flight lead decisions? What were the things the aviators did rather than kind of the overarching strategy that may or may not have been present for the U.S. Navy or the IJN at either time that really drove us to a conclusion as it ended up, instead of us concentrating, on was it the big picture, was it the individual actions, and the individual so often gets left out, which really leads me into my next question, because having read Raven and One and knowing that you're a TAC Air background individual, it's obvious in your writing, because I laughed when I read it. I can imagine some of those editors looking at it going, what is all this aviation speak? What does he mean by this? And thankfully for me, I read Silver Waterfall before I read Raven 1, so I knew that some of it was going to be there. But did you find yourself in Silver Waterfall having to try to decide what was how you remember dive bombing and modern, I will call modern jet tactics, versus maybe some of the things they had to do differently, and so you had to explain in more detail because it wasn't in your mind?
I researched how they did it, and did the SBD did it? We've seen newsreel images of the formation of World War II airplanes. Let's say that they're SBD losses, and the first will peel off, and the second, and they all peel off gracefully up and down, and it really looks great for the camera. But in my research, no, they didn't do that. There would be a flight of three, the lead in front and wingman on either side, or maybe they'd be kind of in trail, maybe. And then dive brakes open up, so they all slow down, and then the lead would just kind of pull across the horizon, kick bottom rudder, roll to end, and just very violently pull his airplane down. So he would just go, and then two would follow, and three would follow. Maybe one potato, two potato, and so they would each be in their individual runs. Certainly, with my background in tactical aviation, diving on something and tracking a target, and then pickling and weapon release, and then feeling the bomb come off, all and then the pull off, all familiar sensations. But these guys would roll into a 90-degree dive, and they didn't have shoulder harnesses. All they had was a seatbelt, so they're kind of hanging off the seat. They're at idle power. The speed brakes, the dive brakes are open, and the wind whistling past the open canopy, and so that they're tracking this target on the water, and the gunner and back is turned around facing front, and he is calling off altitudes as the pilot's tracking. And in my research, I found out that it would be every 1,000 feet until 4,000 feet, and then it'd be 39, 38, 37, 36, all the way down to 2,000 feet, and that's where the pilot should pickle. And then again, a familiar feeling. You can feel the bomb come off the airplane, which is a great feeling. But then you're, and by now the airplane is at 70 degrees as it with the air pressure across the wing. So the bomb comes off at 70 degrees. Now, in my career, we would roll in. The steepest would be, somewhere around 50 degrees, and the bomb would come off a little bit more shallow than that, but never anything approaching 70, much less an initial 90 on the roll-in. And so these guys would pull off, and then they put 9 to 10 Gs on their body unaided. There's no G suits back in those days.
I was laughing about that because that's just something that at least you and I have a frame of reference to. And I would sit there and I go, no wonder they suddenly woke up and they either had hit the water or they were level, because there's just no way without augmentation anyone is going to do that over and over and over again and always keep conscious. It's just amazing.
They may have been conscious, but their vision is
it was a soda straw.
It was a soda straw, and maybe black for a few seconds until they had to let off, and now they got to fight their way out of that. So, and at that time, the gunner is whipping around in his seat and starting shooting at the bad guys that are shooting at them. So I learned a lot, and I wanted to get all those details right. You talk about the detail, and in Raven 1, it is absolutely immersive. All the jargon and acronyms, I mean, we'd fall apart without them, wouldn't we? But in my next two books, I cracked them back about a quarter turn to make maybe a little bit more English.
Yep.
But still, as a reader, you got to hang on. I mean, this is immersive, and this is the real thing. In the Silver Waterfall, there's less jargon than my previous books, but I think I got the right amount. But certainly the reader has just got to hang on. The reader may not know what he or she is reading, but it probably puts them in what's the word? Puts them there. They can imagine themselves. Yeah, whatever 9 Gs means, it must really hurt.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I just laugh anytime I read any naval history, historical fiction that uses deck, bulkhead, and ladder well and doesn't explain it to the poor reader who doesn't have a background in naval terminology. They're just going to have to. Yeah, they're just going to have to figure it out. Exactly. No, that's good. And for me, that it didn't break the wall between me as a reader and you as the author. I didn't feel like I was being talked down to or explained things to, and so it made it much more enjoyable for me to read Silver Waterfall, because I was able to sit there and say, okay, I know these things. I can envision in my mind what the entire, inside of these ships and all these things are like. I can now concentrate on just paying attention to the characters, because for me, going through Silver Waterfall, not having read Shattered Sword, I know that's terrible, horrible person that I am, it was an ability to say, I don't want to concentrate on, is it a true or false historical assumption? I just want to read the story and see where the action is and see what is different than my own, and I'll call it a cultural memory, the Navy Marine Corps cultural memory of Midway. And that's what I really enjoyed. So there's a little bit of dispelling myth and rumor, and then there's characters you see that you're like, yeah, I always kind of assumed that guy was a jerk, but wow, he really is a jerk in this writing.
You gotta, the historic record. It can be quite brutal in the case of some personalities. Yes.
Well, so how did you pick and choose? I mean, there obviously, if you're going to write historical fiction, there generally has to be a little bit of a villain, and you're always going to probably magnify in your invented discussion or interaction, you're gonna have to magnify things for the readers because they may not catch up on the nuances that another aviator, another staff officer would have said. Oh, that was the critical, failing decision, or that was a really bad recommendation to the commander. How did you decide to do those things?
Reading the historic record, and there's, I'm sure we'll talk about some of the just outstanding narrative nonfiction there is on Midway. Dozens of books, and so you read it, and Miles Browning, Captain Browning, and he's got a reputation. So everything I read, that reputation is true. I mean, he was a brilliant naval aviation planner. Although the case can be made, there was underperformance in June 1942 and cataloged elsewhere. That's one example. Frank Jack Fletcher, who technically was the victor at Midway. He was a senior officer present. He was in command of the two task forces, but everyone considers Spruance the victor, and
Right.
and there's Navy politics about that. So try to treat them fairly, but you have to stay with the historic record. There is the famous scene on June 5th where Wade McCluskey, comes out of sickbay and storms up to the flag bridge and demands that his pilots not fly at extreme range with a 1,000-pound bomb, and that shouting match happened. There's no record of what was said, so I invented it, and I think I'm maybe I got it close to right with what each side, in this case Browning and McCluskey, would be saying to each other. But we all know at the end of that shouting match that Spruance turned to McCluskey and said, "I will do what you pilots want." And then we also know that Browning, humiliated, he went down to the bridge and he raged, and then he went to his stateroom and sulked, during the course of the battle, leaving his post, if you will. And the next day he recovered and went on.
Well, I'm glad you talk about that scene because it probably is one of my favorites of the staff officer to operator interaction. And Brett knows this about me. It's one of the funniest things of going between, being a squadron aviator, being a weapons school instructor, being a staff planner and staff officer in Afghanistan. It is funny how many times the critical decisions aren't made by somebody in a dark bunker with the lights on, moving little pieces around a board, or it isn't that always that critical piece of intel that they ran up to the bridge and said, "Here you go, sir. Here's exactly where the enemy fleet is." It's that personal interaction of a operational decision that a staff has teed up, that they think they know what should be done, and the people who actually have to go execute go, "No, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. That goes against everything we're going to do. Why would we do that besides to make you all look better?"
There's amid the fog of war, which was very thick. It's always thick, but in that fog of war, there is ego and jealousy.
No, there's not. Everybody gets along great, and we all love each other in the military, and we're all on the same team. Oh wait, yeah. Oh yeah, there's a lot of ego.
and those things don't change. And I'm also I enjoy doing this. And I did this a little bit in Raven 1, but a lot in Declared Hostile and Fight, where I get into characters on the other side and what they're thinking about the Americans and their next moves and this is all a human activity. And yes. Enemies are, we know deep down they're humans like us. They are our mortal enemies when we're fighting them, but they have emotions too, and they're not sure what's going on, and they want to minimize their losses and maximize their blows. Anyway, all human activity.
Well, and I think that's the beauty of a lot of the historical fiction that isn't written these days, that has been written off and on, but I don't think we do near as much, is we don't explore our enemy's motivations and why our enemy does what they do. It's very easy to paint them as either bumbling incompetents who are just lucky to find a target out there, or as some horrible, scheming, vastly, far more, what I want to say, evil empire than they sometimes are, where they're just other people trying to fight for what they think is their way of life, whether it agrees with our values and our global viewpoint. But so often that's minimized. And I really enjoyed reading Silver Waterfall and not feeling like I was reading stereotypes, because so often I do. And I'll be honest, I get frustrated with especially a lot of the Vietnam era historical fiction, where I'm reading it to kind of get a feeling of some of the aviation piece, but the enemy is just a brutal, unthinking, conniving, cutout, not a real human person. Whereas I didn't feel that at all with Silver Waterfall, so I enjoyed that.
The Japanese thought the Americans were cowards, were idiots. Big noses, red faces. I mean, there's certainly racism, all over the world.
Oh, absolutely.
But the Japanese had not been paying attention to the Americans. After Pearl Harbor, the Americans in February of 1942 were attacking their Central Pacific outposts, and in April of 1942 attacked Japan, and then in May met them and turned them back in the Coral Sea. But still in the first week of June 1942, they thought that the Americans were cowards. The Americans would not come out of Pearl Harbor to face them off Midway. And if they did, they were idiots, and it would be short work. The Japanese had not learned. They had not paid attention. They believed their own press when all the evidence was shown, hey, these guys really want to fight you.
Right. So how did that influence their post-war writing? And was it so much a reaction against that, of people trying to clear their name and now say, no, the Americans weren't idiots, and we in fact were the idiots? Or how does this controversy really happen, where all of a sudden we've got sources that we now discount, 40, 50 years later?
Yes. Mitsuo Fushida was the group commander at the Pearl Harbor raid, and he would have probably led the attack on Midway had he not come down with an appendicitis days before the battle. But he was there in his bathrobe on the bridge of Akagi, part of the brain trust of the First Air Fleet. So he survives the war, and but of course in the years after Midway, he was tasked to write an after-action report. So the Japanese, we need to learn some lessons, and they learned some lessons. They just could not deal with the steel avalanche that fell on them, from the arsenal of democracy.
Well, there's the problem of the inevitability. You fought the American economy at that point, and when we made as many tanks in 1 month as the Germans cranked out in an entire year in 1943, you're not going to win. It's just not going to happen.
Exactly. So after World War II, Japanese, took a serious look inside of themselves. Okay, so we are not as great as we thought. I mean, what they had accomplished, when Commodore Perry visited them in the 1850s, and 50 years after that, they defeat a Western power, Russia, with a Western Navy. I mean, defeated them bad, and then took on the United States, and then crushed. So from a feudal warlord society to toe-to-toe competitor with the United States in one human lifetime is just an incredible achievement by their society. But they looked inward and said, okay, we are a people that we got to stop believing our own press, and we got to be more frank with ourselves, and not have this wishful thinking that our spirit is going to defeat the enemies. That's not going to work. But Fushida said, and I suggest that everyone read his book, the Midway, the Battle that Doomed Japan. It's great reading. But he said that we had 4 carrier decks full of airplanes that are all warmed up engines, all the pilots are in there loaded, and we're just turning into the wind to launch, and here come the Americans. We were so close. And that's not true. What was true, and Parshall and Tully found this out. And how did they do it? They went to Japan and they found the logbook of Akagi, which shows exactly the launch and recoveries that survived, that was saved. And what really happened on Akagi was that there was 3 zeros on the flight deck that that were taking off just as best Krager and Weber were diving on it. Those are the only 3 airplanes on Akagi's flight deck. They were nowhere near ready to launch a strike against the Americans. And what that strike needed to have been launched 2 hours earlier. And they 2 hours before the Americans showed up overhead, it was too late for Japan.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting inevitability in the Battle of Midway that for so many years was not brought out. And it's the difference between disciplined, lockstep kind of attacks versus, as we always in the American way of war, we're just going to figure it out when we get there. And what was supposed to be massive waves launched together becomes, defense in depth in a sense, because we launch everybody on different timelines. But in some ways, our disorganization proves to work out well because it exposes the rigidity of other nations, their ways of war. And the problem is, to answer that, then they have to admit we weren't prepared, because they weren't. As we talk about the aircraft, had they been following their own doctrine, had they been listening to the reports, there would have been a much different set of decisions made. And I think that's one of the interesting leadership parts that you really bring out in the book.
It was Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld that said almost 20 years ago, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had.
Exactly.
And
good old Rummy.
And he was vilified for that, but he spoke the truth.
But it was true. It's true. Yeah.
And that was true in 1941, 42, and it's true today. Quite frankly, I mean, we were facing another peer competitor in the Pacific, and if war comes, it's going to be fought with what we have. There's not going to be any, arsenal democracy that's going to, build 12 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in 3 years. This is as we had, 12 Essex-class ships, and we had all of our light carriers, and don't even talk about the dozens of escort carriers and battleships and cruisers. All of that steel that we talked about earlier. It's not going to happen. Not going to happen right away. So But yes, the Americans were new. Hornet was a brand new ship. Hornet had been in commission for 8 months, and the air wing largely unproven. They had a little bit of training in the Caribbean, and then they delivered the Doolittle Raiders, and they couldn't fly the air wing, and they had maybe a week of training, and then the big one at Midway.
Well, and that's what I really harp on for a lot of people who think about air wings, and Brett and I were even talking about ranks of individuals in these air wings. And normally you think of an air wing that is trained and fought together and may have some replacements in there, so there may be squadron commanders or flight leaders that are of junior rank. And then you end up with Hornet's air wing that pretty much met everybody on the deck. I mean, they met everybody in Pearl and then flew out to the ship, and that's about the level of execution together that they got. And at least the American way of war, we're used to that pickup game. We're used to figuring that out.
Yes. So we did the best we could, and radios of the day were awful. We're so used to all the toys that we have. I mean, we have GPS or INS navigation, and we've got radios, and we've got just situational awareness that they could only have dreamed about in those days. So, but even today, we're going to have 25, 30 airplanes in a big gorilla, and there can be little hiccups even today, and nowhere near the magnified hiccups that we saw in this battle. We're squadrons just going off on their own, and either not finding the enemy, or okay, hey, here we are, where's our escort, come on down and help us, and they're not there. Again, the radio coordination, timing, there was a lot against the Americans that morning, and it was through determination. There was a lot of luck that the attacks hit the mobile force when they did, and then the determination of one man, Wade McCluskey, and also Max Leslie, who lost his bomb on the way to the Japanese. He arms his bomb and it falls off the airplane. using a newfangled electric arming method instead of just reaching down and doing it mechanically the way he had done it all those years. And so imagine that frustration. And he almost turned back and said, "No, I got to keep going." But you're right. I mean, it's American determination and grit, and I say American. Other nations have that too, but it is a feature, I believe, of our people.
Well, I think it's part of the American psyche, and it comes from being a frontier nation. We can all debate until the cows come home, literally. What is the dominant psyche of America? But I think at that time there was still so much of a frontier, rural, hands-on kind of mentality. People were used to making do, having come out of the Depression, and more importantly, they were used to, well, we're just going to keep pressing. We're gonna fight through this, and we're gonna figure out. And I still laugh thinking, at Midway we had electric arming mechanisms. In Vietnam we had electric fuses that didn't work. It's interesting how many times gremlins are the thing that jump up in the American war narrative, and Americans like, well, whatever, we'll figure it out. I guess we're strafing today instead of bombing.
and will there be battles in the future of humanity and in our country? And probably yes. And we're probably going to learn of glitches, and they're going to happen.
Absolutely.
It's just part of it.
Well, and we've seen it with aircraft, whether it's the F-22 and the ones and zeros being in the wrong spot, such that when they left Hawaii and went on towards Wake Island, suddenly they couldn't cross the international date line because their nav system wasn't properly configured, so they had to turn around and get a quick software fix and go out a couple weeks later. There's always going to be interesting things as you marry technology with the human element of combat, and how do you deal with that? When do you say, all right, I don't care about all this gear you've put in the airplane, and my goal is to put a weapon into another enemy fighter or onto enemy targets. I will do that to the best of my ability without even all the fancy equipment. I think that's always something that's interesting, which, as you kind of alluded to, is a difference than that country that people and I like to laugh about. I refer to them as the paper dragon, because there's a very different mindset. And I'll be honest, I haven't read some of your later books, so I haven't seen how you handle them. But there's a difference in operational mindset, I think, between so many countries, and it's fascinating to read it in people's fictional writing as to how countries troubleshoot through things, and how do they decide, are we going to turn the strike back or not? Do we've lost 30% of our bombs? Hey, maybe it's time to go home, and other countries would make different decisions.
You have not read it yet, but you have touched on an aspect of Fight, which is my fictional account of what's going to happen in the Western Pacific, and the United States. Everyone in uniform, certainly everyone that is flying a military aircraft, has a very high degree of training, and that's not always the case for foreign air forces.
Absolutely.
And there might be there might be elite squadrons and squadrons that are just kind of there, and they fly around and call it training, and that's not going to be good enough.
Well, and that's something that's fascinating as we step from the historical account into kind of the wargaming piece of it, is how do you simulate equitably without penalizing people for wanting to play a nation that may not have had the finest air force out there? How do you allow them to kind of explore the history and say, either this phase of the Second World War, this phase of modern era, I may have really good airplanes, but I don't have good pilots. I know Brett and I have laughed about every time you have to play late war Japanese, you're like, well, I'm pretty much guaranteed I won't have any aces left. I'm pretty much guaranteed I won't have high quality pilots, but you still, at least when you step into the war game arena, while you can check that box and say, I'm going to be historically accurate, sometimes it's tough because you have to make it fun. And it's kind of like reading a novel. It's if the enemy's a pushover in the novel, it's not that exciting of a thriller. There has to be something going on.
There's a great place for wargaming, and wargaming is fiction. And what if we did this? What if they react this way? I was at the War College right before I did my penance in the Pentagon. We did a war game, and it lasted 3 weeks, and it was fun to play. It was kind of like we were there. Now we were obviously in a classroom setting, a staff setting. But you think, hey, here's what we're going to do. Oh, here's what they did. That didn't expect that. Now we have to deal with it.
Absolutely. Well, that was one of the fascinating things that Mitch from the No Dice, No Glory podcast and I talked with Liz over on Beyond Solitaire about military wargaming and how it varies by service and then varies with the level you're at. If there's, it can be as simple as what are your kill removal rules and your rules in air-to-air for how do you simulate the actual day-to-day probability of kill of your missiles versus going to something like the War College where it might even be a fairly non-kinetic kind of war game you're playing. Because a lot of times what we found, at least in the later years of the War College era, is the tough part isn't necessarily coming up with a plan that will survive first contact with the enemy. It's what's my plan that's going to survive first contact with all my other governmental agencies? Because now so much of our fight is working with the Department of State, FBI, other governmental agencies, and how do I make a plan they're going to sign off on?
and this is also something that you'll see in Fight, which is a modern conflict in the information era, to include the disinformation era. Yes,
absolutely, because it's it's an interesting thing we don't always take into account is that there were so many decisions in World War II that were made either on open source reporting or on very cursory spy accounts, and entire raids launched on airfields that didn't exist, or raids that turned back because their bombardiers looked at it, they're like, no, all I see is a bunch of fields. Well, we ran out some conveniently blue and brown felt out there and made the runway strip look more like a field, and it had a lot of effect.
A bodyguard of lies.
Tie that right back to Midway. The U.S. Army Air Corps took credit for it.
Yes, they did. And
everybody in Hawaii thought the Army won the battle.
I like to joke that yes, the Army Air Force did take credit for sinking the Japanese fleet at Midway, and we have to remember that 4 years later, was it 5 years later, they became the United States Air Force.
Yeah, there are always political reasons behind all that, and I've picked on my Navy brethren a lot as we talk about the paper dragon. That if it's truly a paper dragon, you don't have a reason to buy more ships and more airplanes and more over the horizon capability. But there always is an interesting dynamic, especially in the Second World War, and then even more so into Korea when you get into it, of kind of decomposing some of this inter-service rivalry that's in the historical accounts. And it was funny to me because I, growing up as, in a sense, I'll say a naval aviation baby, having graduated from a small public college on the Severn River in Annapolis, and gone on to be in Marine Corps aviation, I'd never heard the Army take credit for it. And then when I started reading the accounts, I'm like, who are these guys and who do they think they are thinking they won the battle?
The B-17s and the B-26s gave a good account of themselves. I mean, the B-17s, disrupted the fleet maneuvers. The ships have to turn to avoid the attacks, and when the ship's heeling hard, it's hard to run elevators. It's hard to load a 2,000-pound weapon onto an airplane in the hangar bay. The B-26, though, those guys, they went right at Akagi, and there's an account in the Silver Waterfall. They're pretty eye-opening, and that actually happened. I mean, these guys were carrying torpedoes and they had no training on how to deliver them. The night before, American PBY patrol planes, flying boats, they rigged a torpedo to one and dropped it on a Japanese ship, and it hit it and went off. I mean, that was the only successful American torpedo attack of the battle.
Well, Brett, does that sound pretty familiar to what you're used to, at least from the Malta side?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting piece for the converted bombers suddenly becoming torpedo bombers, and even the piece of how level bombing attacks can influence a ship, because so many times we years later have seen the footage from after the fact where it seems so easy for the ship to be down there dodging these attacks from 15,000 feet or so, but when you're on that ship that's heeling over, you're not getting a whole lot done. You're not necessarily firing your deck guns or, like you say, loading ordnance on aircraft. You're fighting for your own survival.
Yes, and we're all familiar with the term, you must honor the threat. So they had to react to it. They really didn't have a choice. That the Army B-17s missed, it should be no surprise to anyone. They're not designed for that. I mean, even they would mass 100, 300 bombers to hit a place like Schweinfurt, and not every bomb is going to hit the target, but it's certainly damage is going to be done.
Well, Brett, I think that's an interesting discussion on our side for how much we've seen how it plays out in Blood Red Skies and with the airstrike rules, playing out level bombing versus ships, but there really doesn't seem to be much counteraction on the ship side, because I think you'd say from when you used your Ju-88s level bombing or even your Ju-87s dive bombing against the ship, it was I basically was able to ignore you. It wasn't that I had to either give up the ability to shoot flak or anything else like that.
Yeah, that's right. Any that were doing level bombing or even dive bombing were virtually no effect. And probably the best effect they had was just maybe a temporary distraction for your fighter force or something to maybe provide a screen, if you will, for those bombers that were equipped with the torpedoes.
Yeah, because I think that was, at least for our thought process, was the way the rules were written, that was the percentage threat. So not really care about the level bombers, the dive bombers, let them have their fun. I have to take out the torpedo bombers, which is kind of interesting when you compare that to the Midway account and you realize, okay, the torpedo bombers did get taken out, and even when they did deliver, they were fairly ineffective. But it became the dive bombers that really, in the sense, got the hits that were required to sink the carriers.
It was dive bombers that accounted for the highest amount of Japanese naval tonnage in World War II, and you would think, really, not submarines, and submarines obviously did great work, but as far as warships tonnage, it was dive bombers. And so when you think about it, I mean, 4 carriers in Midway and other Coral Sea and the Solomons fights and elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it does make sense that it was dive bombers that put those ships on the bottom.
Absolutely, and that's one of the tough things as a game designer and setting up the tournaments for these games and doing all those things is to play inside the rules you're handed, but also to make sure that it's enjoyable for people. And I know Brett and I've talked to Andy about the upcoming Midway release and the fact that you have to kind of make the scenarios a little bit fun. And unfortunately, the Midway narrative doesn't necessarily have any of the VTs winning the day with torpedoes, but you still have to put a scenario in there so you can say, okay, what if? Let's see. Let's see what would happen.
At Coral Sea, the American torpedo planes had some success on the first day of the battle. Yep. Against the carrier Shoho. The second day, not so much, but they weren't annihilated like they were at Midway. There was better coordination at Coral Sea, all right, but there was and there was not that coordination at Midway. So they knew that they were flying rattle traps, and gosh, we sure wish we had that new Grumman, but this is what we have, and they were frank about it in the ready room. Squadron COs, I think the first wave, maybe half of us will be shot down. Imagine being in a ready room and hearing that. And then imagine being in BT-8, and then Skipper Waldron gives you this letter, this mimeographed letter that he wrote that says, if there is only one of you guys left, I want you to go in and get a hit. Only one of us?
Yeah, that's pretty sobering. You just don't have that frame of reference in naval aviation anymore.
And not anymore. And yet they went.
Yeah, absolutely, which is truly amazing. It's it's interesting. I know we've talked about the historical record a number of times and said it's easy for us to look back and go, wow, holy cow, they all got shot down, and I can't believe one guy got picked up out of the whole squadron. And yet at the same time, I think you did a good job of in the book. There's people going, yeah, I may still make it out of there. I'm pretty sure the other guy's going to get hit, or yeah, we're going to take some losses, but maybe I'll make it through. And that kind of optimistic fatalism that's in naval aviation.
I mean, how else can you approach it? I don't
think there's any other way.
Sure.
Kevin,
And
in your
go
in
ahead.
your research on the torpedo bombers, were you able to find some good, doctrine or the tactics that VT8 and VT6 were trained to? Because it seemed very realistic.
What they wanted to do was the classic anvil attack. So you've got a squadron, 14, 15 airplanes, and you split them up. So 7 go this way, 8 go that way. So you split up the squadron. They go and the target is probably going to be running away from you. So you're chasing it down, and so you're whipping the ponies at 110 knots, and the ship's running away from you at say 30 knots. So it's going to take a while to get there. But if you get ahead of your target and then turn in on it, to whichever way the ship turns is probably going to take a hit. That was the goal. And at 1,000 yards, half a mile. And you have to slow to 80 knots. I mean, you have to go slow from 110 to 80. I mean, you're already, 110 is nothing. Even in 1942, 110 was nothing.
What's stall speed of a Devastator?
Probably not much below 80. And I imagine, carrying a torpedo probably right, within a few knots of that. So you just want to, okay, I'm going to slow down here. I'm going to descend to 80 feet and just want to get this thing out. And you're just tracers are everywhere. And the water is just churned white, and the gunner behind you is shooting at something. We can only imagine the fear, the sensory overload, the frantic. I just want to drop this thing and get out of here. But again, they through their training, they could at least take a bearing on the target and get to a point to drop before they did.
With Ensign Gay being the only survivor, did you call on any reports that he wrote to kind of frame your narrative?
It's a great question. I read his book. I not cover to cover, but I jump around the Midway time, and he's helpful with his impressions of what the squadron was doing. How else would we know that Skipper Waldron got out on one wing, his cockpit's burning, so he's on one wing, he has no choice, and then before he crashes into the water. Now, how true is that? And I think it's true. Was it exactly like that? We don't know. We have one man who told us, one flawed human being, but I believe it is, and that was his impression, and who am I or anyone to refute it?
Yeah, that was an amazing attack to read through. I like just a final comment about the characters we're talking about, the real people. The afterword that you put into Silver Waterfall is great, where you give just a brief summary of kind of what happened to a lot of these people.
I think that when people read that, and thank you, I've received compliments about that. That some of these guys went on to great careers in the military, and some lost their lives only weeks later in brutal, industrial combat. That's World War II. It reminds people that these were real men. These were our grandfathers and great grandfathers. That the elderly that we see at church, on canes and walkers. 60 years before, they were really something. They were real studs. And so we see our elderly today, and we can read the afterwards of these young fighters, and passing away in their 90s of old age, various ailments, and I think it get a greater appreciation for not only them but all the elderly in our society.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to sit there and talk through the dynamic, as there unfortunately there seems to be very little middle ground for the telling of the stories, that so many people are afraid that if you call into account any of the history, that you're somehow taking away from the heroes that are telling the story. And I think there always has to be a little bit of the, we all know how sea stories are, and we know we embellished our own. that you sit there and you say, I want to really do my best to get to that history. And as we've talked about, sometimes it just takes that generation to not be alive, so you don't feel like you're insulting their legacy. To step back and say, okay, Now I can take the heroic out of it, and I can deal with the human, which the book to me does such a great job with. It doesn't really try to lionize a lot of these people. It just says these are some really tough human decisions made very quickly. So it's not like someone thinking, all right, I've only got 6 months to live. What am I going to do? It's someone waking up and going, tomorrow I'm probably going to die. I'm probably not going to make it through this attack. How am I going to live out my last 24 hours?
Yes, and if you face combat, I mean, I experienced combat. It was a little skirmish. I'm embarrassed as we're talking about the Battle of Midway to even mention, my experience, way up high in the air, dropping a precision weapon and not really feeling too concerned. But yes, you think about that. Okay, this is combat, and am I right with God? Have I written that letter that I have tucked away, and in case I don't come back, that letter will be sent home, and this is emotional stuff. You compartmentalize, but you also you think about that. But I also believe that you're going to go. You can't not go, and you're just in that. Everyone's going, and again, my experience was nothing that those guys faced. They knew that half of them going in weren't going to make it back.
Right.
None of us have experienced that. Will today's generation rise to the occasion like they did in 1942? I believe the answer to that question is yes. I think that the human beings in World War II were faced with these situations, and they responded. That's all they could do, and their accounts are legendary. As of course, we won that great World War. There are people doing legendary things over the skies of the Middle East, on the ground in Afghanistan, and earlier in Iraq, earlier in this century, the combats that we've had. They are, our current generation is just as great.
Absolutely, and I think there's so much. We've said before, there's so much emotion in current conflict that it is tough for people, whether they are ardent fans and fanboys, fangirls of the U.S. military, or they are people that really want to step back and dissect what we've done and say, did we make the right decisions? There's so much emotion there that it's very difficult to be dispassionate and removed from it. And I hope that in years hence, we're able to step back and take a look at some of those accounts, because I know for the Marines that I served with in Afghanistan, especially in the later years, not so much in the very early years, but in the 2009-2010 timeframe, we had U.S. Marines who had experienced more days of direct fire combat in a 6-month tour than their counterparts had experienced in all of World War II. And sure, it was not the same horror. It was not losing 10,000, 20,000 people in beach assaults. But when you think about the weight that it carries on the human psyche just to be in those kind of operations day in, day out, I agree with you. I think this generation has risen to the occasion. I think they've done very well. I jokingly laugh because I don't consider myself, I'm that old guy, so I trained some of those guys out there, but I'm certainly not one of them. I had a very different experience. And they've done well for those men and women have definitely, I think, been just as dedicated and just as amazing as their World War II counterparts. What I will say is it is funny to me the things that are their Pearl Harbor moments, and it's just interesting is because every generation looks at things differently. My generation had 9/11. Every generation has different things that pulled it into that Pearl Harbor moment. And it's, I guess as an amateur historian, it's always fascinating to me to say, what was it that tipped you over the edge to say you wanted to put on the uniform and do something that very few other people actually do with their lives?
I couldn't say it better. Absolutely.
Well, Brett, I know we've kind of left you out there. Sorry, we're talking naval aviation. We left the Army Ranger out there for only a couple questions. Is there anything that you, in closing, wanted to cover?
No, I just really appreciate it. I mean, I've read a lot of the accounts of the Battle of Midway, but I feel like still quite a novice on the subject, and I really feel like I'm learning a lot, and I can't wait to dig into the book.
Yeah, I know that'll be our problem getting ready for the release of Midway and the Blood Red Skies Midway starter kit. We got more historical research to do just when we think we're done researching Malta and researching Vietnam for some of the other releases. Now we're back at digging into the history books.
Well, I can suggest as a last subject, let's talk about Jimmy Thatch and the famous Thatch Weave, and maybe ask Kevin what kind of resources, firsthand account did you find from Jimmy about the development of that tactic? And Doug, you and Brett can spin it to how it works in Blood Red Sky.
Jimmy Thatch, thought about, okay, what can I do with my F4F Wildcat, my barrel-shaped fighter here? I can't climb as good as a Zero. I can't turn with it, but I can go in a dive pretty well. But I can take a beating. I'm flying a tough airplane. So we figured, all right, if we are flying a beam each other in a section tactics, I can look behind my wingman and see his 6, and he can look behind mine and see my 6. And if someone is attacking him, he can turn into me, I turn into him, and I can shoot the guy off his tail. What the Navy did very well throughout the 20s and 30s and into World War II is train for high deflection gunshots, high angle off, and today we would say that this is a snapshot. Just something that appears, okay, here's a guy flying in front of me. I'll just hold the trigger down and stitch some bullets across him. Not so much of a 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock tracking shot. So Thatch said we have this beam defense maneuver. We can't turn with these guys, but if we work together, when one goes on you, I'll shoot him off. If he goes on me, then you shoot him off my tail. And he didn't spend a whole lot of time briefing his guys on it. He just kind of tried it on the fly on the morning of June 4th over the mobile force. And he would yell to his wingman, "Hey wingman, go out there, beam me and act like a section leader." And that was the brief.
That was amazing.
And then the guy would figure it out, and hey, this works pretty cool. And so the Japanese that fighting 3 from Yorktown, they had not experienced Americans fighting like that before. Typically, Americans would they would maneuver the best they could and bleed all their airspeed and get shot. I mean, that's what the Japanese expected would always happen. But these guys fought differently with Jimmy Thatch and his famous Thatch Weave.
And so after the battle, did Thatch push that into the fighter doctrine and propagate that information?
Yes, he did. And so he got shore duty as an instructor at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. And so he taught that. And then, the word gets around, hey, do you hear what Jimmy Thatch did or is doing down in Jacksonville? Yeah, we should, hear the guys on let's say the new carrier Bunker Hill. Let's pick a carrier. Yeah, we should fight our Hellcats using that tactic. That makes a lot of sense. So, the word got out through the good old fashioned networking of the day. Nothing like the chat and all the social media that JOs have today to do that.
So to translate that into the tabletop game, is it an ideal spacing to be about 2 turn radiuses away from each other?
Well, so unfortunately, with Blood Red Skies, and I'm sure Andy Chambers, the game designer, will throw a spear back at me via email as soon as he listens to this episode. One of the things it supports poorly is the turn radius and the amount of time. So what we often find is rather than being, as you say, two turn radii out there, being approximately in this game, that would be about 13 inches apart. You're not going to do that. What you're going to do is you're going to give the enemy the same horns of the Vadilima, as we would call it. You're going to set up your aircraft probably about 5 inches apart, and you're going to stagger them as well, because just limitations of the game, it's tough to very quickly turn in on somebody else, unless, as Brett will remind you, unless you're a cheater that flies a Zero or a Spitfire and has the tight turn trait. So I did laugh as Kevin refers to their tight turning ability. It is pretty amazing in the game. And so what you'll do is you'll stagger your flight so that you make the enemy choose if he's going to pitch at 1 of your fighters. Your other one can turn in and can take a deflection shot on him. But Kevin really hits on something that's interesting that is not simulated well in Blood Red Skies, and that is the ability of air forces to train to high deflection shooting. It's generally, once again, our game designer is from the UK. It is seen as a skill that certain aces had. And so you've obviously got Bierling, who was one of probably the best, at least self-aggrandized, deflection shooters in history, because he practiced it. He thought it through. He visualized how to shoot high-angle deflection shots. But until you get to Thatch kind of shepherding some of his younger pilots around, you don't have people taking those shots very successfully. And Blood Red Skies doesn't necessarily simulate that always well. So it can kind of be frustrating.
Could be a new doctrine chart or doctrine card dropped at the launch.
I agree. So that's, as Brett, as you and I have talked about, one of the weird things is we have quote unquote doctrine cards, but we don't so much have tactics cards. And so it's kind of another level of flavor and chrome and everything inside a board game like that, where you say, I realize that as the Allies, this is how I'm supposed to fight in these formations and these other things, but I just need something that differentiates Fighting 3 from any other squadron out there. Or if you're looking at Malta, that's going to differentiate what Bierling and his compatriots talked about in between missions, where they said, you know what, we're going to go out there and we're going to ignore the bombers. We're just going to go in and we're going to pull the fighters down and see who's the first idiot to jump us out there. So it's I think there's some fascinating tactics that could be played out that way. So Rob, when you come over and give up your Check Your Six world and join us over in Blood Red Skies,
hey,
we'll absolutely school you with some of that.
That's already happened.
I know, and I'm glad you were on there for our virtual Gathering of Eagles when you were in there and playing in the game with us. That was good. And
I'm ready to fly a Zero or a Wildcat.
Well, funny you should bring that up. So I will say this to the wider community. We asked Warlord Games if we could release Pacific stuff in the virtual tabletop sim world. And we got a little bit of the teeth suck. But what I think is going to come out next is Korea and MiG Alley. I think that will get a virtual release next to kind of say, all right, here's your World War II starter set. Here's your Korea starter set. Virtually, go play those things. And when we all get out of this pandemic and can afford to touch each other's models and dice and and cough on each other across the table, then we'll be back to playing those the Midway games. But we'll see. They could always surprise me, and I throw it out to the listeners. It is not inconsequential, the amount of feedback that gets to Warlord that makes a difference. So when their executives hear from all the gamers that they want to be able to play digitally and play Pacific Theater, that carries a lot of weight. So send them emails, comment on social media. Please don't tell them how wonderful the Lead Pursuit podcast is. They won't believe you anyway. They know what a bunch of douchebags we are. But they're a great company to partner with, and they treat us very well.
So Kevin, what's next on your slate? Are you going to stick with World War II or back to Raven?
I think Flip is going to be promoted to Rear Admiral. And he's going to go to sea again. I think that I want him to command a strike group in the Mediterranean, European theater, and we might travel the length and breadth of the seas around Europe and above Europe, and maybe the Russian Navy might make an appearance. So that's what I think we have in store for Flip.
That sounds great. And I'd love to see another World War II book, but Flip is that's awesome too. Thanks.
I think that's, and another World War II book is I'm thinking about that. Naval aviation, of course, is in my wheelhouse, and there are other there's some other terrific battles in World War II involving naval aviation, but none can compare to the drama and the importance, what was at stake at Midway.
Well, if you really feel like you want to tell a humorous story, you can always write the accounts of Guadalcanal and the Cactus Air Force and the poor Navy squadrons that got left by their carrier-borne brethren and assigned to the Cactus Air Force and suddenly found out how the Marines wage war.
Exactly, yes.
unwilling volunteers.
Exactly. Congratulations for donating your aircraft to the United States Marine Corps. You're now part of the Cactus Air Force.
Well, thanks for joining us, Kevin. I really enjoyed Silver Waterfall and learning more about Midway and bringing it to a personal story of the key characters on both sides. Really had a great impact. Thanks again.
Rob, thank you very much. It's great to be on the podcast. The books are all on Amazon, one-stop shop, and they're all in Kindle or print or audiobook now. And I'll keep going. But I thank you very much for having me on, and a great wide-ranging discussion about the Pacific War and Midway and all things flying. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being on. I really appreciate it. Obviously, we're looking forward to seeing what you write next, and obviously, I found you through Kindle on Amazon. What is the easiest way for people to find you, either on social media or to follow your developments, rather than just waiting for the next book to hit the Kindle?
Sure, Kevin Miller Author, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and then my website is also kevinmillerauthor.com. Drop me a note. If you like what you read, reviews are very helpful, and people leave them on Amazon and also on Goodreads. They just people put the word out in podcasts like this, and that is very much appreciated. I'm so pleased that people are learning about modern aviation through my books, and then about a great battle through the Silver Waterfall.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on the podcast, Kevin, and Rob. Thanks for helping put all this together. It's always good to have our brothers from the Fights On team back in there, and I've got your Midway Island terrain all painted up. So this week at Twisted Lords Convention, hopefully we'll be doing a few Midway bombing raids.
Thanks. Can't wait to see the pictures.
Yeah, should be good.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Absolutely.